I killed 32 men without them ever seeing me. Not because I was a good shot, I was average at best. Not because I was brave, I was scared out of my skull the entire time. I killed them because I looked like dirt. Literally, mud in my hair, smeared across my cheeks, packed into the seams of my uniform until I smelled like a wet dog and rotten leaves. This was the Hurtgen Forest, November 1944, and the Germans owned those woods. They had the high ground, the sight lines, the numbers. We were 12 men trying to ambush a 40-man patrol, and by every tactical measure, we should have been slaughtered. But Corporal Harlow, this quiet Montana boy who barely spoke, except to tell stories about elk hunting, he turned us into something the enemy couldn't recognize. We didn't hide behind the terrain. We became the terrain, and when the shooting started, it was over in 4 minutes. I'm 83 years old now, and I still can't scrub that day out of my memory. Not the blood, not the screams. The silence that came after. Most people remember D-Day. The Bulge, even Bastonia gets its due. But nobody talks about the Hurtgen Forest, and there's a reason for that. It was a meat grinder, 50 square miles of dense German woodland along the Belgian-German border, and the U.S. Army tried to push through it for 3 months straight. We lost over 33,000 men there. Trees so thick artillery would airburst in the canopy and rain shrapnel down like steel hail. Mud so deep you'd lose your boots if you stood still too long. Visibility maybe 20 yards on a good day, and that's if the fog lifted. I was a rifleman with the 28th Infantry Division. The Bloody Bucket, they called us because of our red keystone patch. Some said it looked like a bucket. Others said it was because we bled so much we might as well have been carrying buckets to catch it all. By early November of '44, we'd been in that forest for 2 weeks, and we'd barely moved half a mile. The Germans had every advantage. They knew the terrain. They had bunkers. They were dug in deep and comfortable, while we froze in shallow holes filled with rainwater. Our job was to secure a small ridgeline that overlooked a dirt supply road the Wehrmacht was using to move ammunition and reinforcements toward the front. The stakes weren't glamorous. We weren't liberating Paris. We weren't storming a beach. We were trying to cut off a backwoods supply route in the middle of nowhere, and if we failed, the Germans would keep funneling troops and guns into the bulge forming to our south. High Command didn't care about our names. They cared about the road. And nobody remembers this battle because it wasn't a battle. It was 1,000 small, ugly fights that bled together into one long nightmare. No famous generals, no headlines, just cold, wet, exhausted boys trying to stay alive long enough to matter. The Hurtgen in early November felt like the end of the world. Freezing rain every morning. Fog so thick you couldn't see the man next to you. Trees packed so close together you had to turn sideways to move between them. And the smell, God, the smell, wet wool, rotten wood, cordite, and that sour fear sweat that gets into everything. There was a constant crack of distant rifle fire like the forest was slowly eating itself. My squad had started with 36 men back in October. By November 7th, there were 12 of us left. Most of us were teenagers. I was 18, fresh off a farm in Pennsylvania. Corporal Harlow was the oldest at 26, and that felt ancient when you're barely old enough to vote. He'd been a hunting guide back in Montana before the war, one of those quiet types who could walk through the woods without making a sound. He had this habit of chewing birch bark when he was nervous. said it reminded him of home. We'd been on that ridge line for 72 hours with minimal sleep, cold rations, and dwindling ammo. Every night, rumors would circulate. The Germans are pulling back. No, they're reinforcing. No, they're preparing a counterpush. Nobody knew what was true, and nobody trusted the radio chatter anymore. The only thing we knew for certain was that we were cold, we were tired, and we were probably going to die in these woods. Then, on the morning of November 7th, orders came down from Lieutenant Casper. He was barely older than me, maybe 22, with a baby face that made him look like he should have been working at a hardware store, not leading men into combat. A Wehrmacht patrol, estimated 40 men, was moving up the supply road at dawn. Our squad was tasked with ambushing them at a choke point where the road narrowed between two ridges. The problem was obvious. There was no cover. The Germans would spot us from 200 yards out if we tried to dig in the normal way. We were outnumbered more than 3 to 1. We were exhausted. We were low on ammunition. Private Yost, this kid from Ohio with red hair and freckles, started shaking so badly he dropped his rifle. Corporal Briggs suggested we radio for artillery support, but Casper just shook his head. Every gun was pointed at the bulge. We were on our own. That night, the night before the ambush, Harlow gathered us around a small, smokeless fire. He was chewing birch bark, working it between his teeth like tobacco. He stared into the flames for a long time, not saying anything, and we all just sat there waiting because Harlow didn't waste words. Finally, he spoke. He told us a story about his grandfather back in Montana, how the old man used to hunt elk in the Bitterroot Mountains during the Depression to feed the family. He said his grandfather taught him to cover himself in mud and pine needles to become part of the forest floor, so the elk couldn't distinguish him from a log or a rock. Animals see shapes, movement, contrast, he said. Humans are the same when they're scared and moving fast. Then he looked at each of us, one by one, his face orange in the firelight. He said, "We're not going to dig foxholes tomorrow. We're not going to hide behind trees. We're going to become the ground." Half the squad thought he'd lost his mind. The other half was too tired to argue. He explained it carefully. We'd cover ourselves head to toe in mud, moss, dead leaves, broken branches. We'd lie motionless in the open along the road's edge. The Germans would walk right past us because they wouldn't be looking for men. They'd be looking for soldiers, for helmets and rifles and shapes that looked human. I remember Yost asking what happens if they see us. Harlow just said, "Then we die. But we're going to die anyway if we fight them head on. At least this way, we choose when to start shooting." Casper gave his reluctant approval. He said, "If it works, you're a genius. If it doesn't, you're all dead, and I'll get blamed." Then he walked off to smoke a cigarette alone. I didn't sleep that night. None of us did. We sat there passing around a canteen of cold coffee, not talking much, just existing together in the dark. I kept thinking about my mother back home, wondering if she was awake, if she was praying for me. I wondered if prayers even worked in a place like the Hurtgen. Pre-dawn, we moved into position along the eastern edge of the supply road. It was still dark, that deep black before the sun even thinks about rising. We could hear the forest waking up around us, distant birds, the creak of frozen branches, the occasional pop of a tree splitting from the cold. Harlow went first. He knelt down and scooped up handfuls of cold, wet mud and started smearing it across his face, then his neck, then his hands. He packed moss into his collar and tucked pine branches into his webbing and scattered leaves over his legs. One by one, we followed. It felt absurd. It felt like something children would do playing war in the backyard, except this was real and we were about to try to kill 40 men. The mud was freezing. It got under my fingernails, into my ears, down the back of my shirt. I smeared it across my helmet, my rifle stock, every exposed surface. I packed it into the seams of my uniform. Briggs helped me tuck branches into my pack straps. Yost covered his red hair with a layer of mud so thick he looked like a golem from a fairy tale. When we were done, we didn't look like soldiers anymore. We looked like corpses that had crawled out of shallow graves. Harlow gave us our final instructions. Don't move. Don't scratch. Don't breathe heavy. If they walk on you, let them. If they sit on you, let them. If they look directly at you, don't blink. We're not men anymore. We're part of the forest. Then we lay down. I found a shallow depression next to a fallen log, maybe 15 feet from the edge of the road. I pressed myself flat, my M1 Garand tucked under my chest, and I waited. The forest was still dark, but I could see the faint gray line of dawn starting to break through the canopy above. Fog rolled low over the road like something alive. We waited for 40 minutes. It felt like 40 hours. My nose itched. A cramp started forming in my left calf. My heart was pounding so loud I was convinced the Germans would hear it from a mile away. I could hear Yost breathing a few feet to my left, shallow and quick, like a rabbit. I wanted to tell him to calm down, but I couldn't move, couldn't speak. We were stone now. Then I heard them, the rhythmic crunch of boots on frozen dirt, low voices speaking German, the metallic clink of equipment. My whole body tensed, but I forced myself to stay loose, stay flat, stay dead. They appeared out of the fog like ghosts. 40 men moving in a loose column, rifles slung over shoulders, some of them smoking cigarettes. They looked relaxed, confident. They thought they owned this forest. And why wouldn't they? They'd been winning here for weeks. The first German walked within 5 feet of my head. I could see his boots, black leather covered in mud, the laces caked with dirt. I could hear him breathing. He said something to the man behind him and laughed. They walked right past me, right over Briggs. One of them nearly stepped on Yost's hand. Then one of them stopped. He was young, maybe 17, with blond hair sticking out from under his Feldmütze cap. He was standing maybe 3 feet from Harlow, looking at something caught on a branch, a torn piece of American webbing left over from a previous skirmish. He bent down, picked it up, examined it. He was now crouching 2 feet from Harlow's mud-caked face. I could see Harlow's eyes through the mud, completely still, unblinking, like stone, like a dead man. The German's hand moved toward his rifle. My finger tightened on my trigger. If he raised that rifle, we were all dead. Every second stretched into an eternity. I could hear my own pulse in my ears, a dull thud, thud, thud that drowned out everything else. Then another German called out from up the road, something about moving faster, about the cold, about wanting breakfast. The young soldier dropped the webbing, stood up, and jogged to catch up with his squad. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. The rest of the patrol continued past us. 40 men, completely unaware that 12 Americans were lying motionless within arm's reach. It took maybe 6 minutes for them to pass, but it felt like I aged 6 years. Once the last German was 20 yards past our position, Harlow made a sound, a low 2-note whistle, a bird call he'd taught us back at camp. It was the signal. 12 mud-covered Americans rose from the ground like revenants, like the dead climbing out of their graves. The Germans turned around, and for 3 seconds, nobody moved. They didn't understand what they were seeing. They thought we were partisans, maybe, or ghosts, or a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. Then Harlow fired, a single M1 shot that echoed through the forest and dropped the patrol's lead sergeant. And we opened up. 12 rifles firing in unison from 15 yards away. It was devastating. The Germans were caught in the open with no cover. Some dropped immediately. Some ran. Some tried to return fire blindly into the trees, not understanding that we weren't in the trees. We were on the ground they just walked over. I fired until my Garand's clip pinged out. Reloaded. Fired again. The air filled with smoke, and the sharp smell of gunpowder and the wet thud of bodies hitting mud. Yost was hit in the shoulder, but kept shooting. Briggs threw a grenade that detonated near a cluster of Germans trying to regroup behind a fallen tree. Someone was screaming in German. Someone else was screaming in English. I couldn't tell who. The fight lasted 4 minutes. Then, silence. The kind of silence that presses on your ears because something loud and terrible just ended. 32 Germans dead or dying. 8 wounded and surrendering, hands raised, faces white with shock. On our side, Yost with a shoulder wound, Private Delano grazed by shrapnel, Harlow unscathed, somehow, standing in the middle of the road with mud still caked on his face, looking like a creature from a nightmare. I walked through the aftermath, young faces, boys like me, sprawled in the mud in positions that didn't look human anymore. One dying German soldier, maybe 16 years old, reached out toward me, not for a weapon, just reaching. Briggs knelt beside him and gave him water from a canteen. The boy died 30 seconds later, staring up at the gray sky through the trees. I felt sick, not from fear, from the realization of what we'd done. We weren't heroes. We were survivors who got lucky and mean. Casper radioed the success back to battalion. They ordered us to hold position and secure the German weapons and supplies. We spent the next 2 hours stripping the bodies, ammunition, rations, maps, intelligence documents. I found a letter in one soldier's pocket written in German, obviously from a mother or sister. I couldn't read it, but I pocketed it anyway. Still have it today, in a box with my dog tags. That night, Harlow sat apart from the group, staring into nothing. I approached him, asked if he was okay. He looked at me with those tired eyes and said, "My grandfather used that trick to feed his family. I just used it to kill 40 men. Don't know how I feel about that." I didn't have an answer. He said, "You did good today, all of you, but don't mistake this for glory. We just made widows and orphans on both sides." The ambush disrupted German resupply efforts for 3 days, long enough for American artillery to reposition and shore up the southern flank. The intelligence documents we recovered revealed troop movements that got passed up the chain and contributed to defensive planning during the Battle of the Bulge, which began a month later. The 28th Infantry Division kept fighting in the Hürtgen until mid-December. We suffered staggering casualties. Of the 12 men in my squad, only 7 survived the war. Harlow was killed 2 weeks later by a tree burst, a shell that detonated in the canopy above him. He never saw it coming. Casper made it home, became a school teacher in Pennsylvania. Yost lost his arm to infection, but lived to 79. Briggs disappeared after the war. Nobody knows what happened to him. I'm an old man now, 83 years and change. My hands shake when it's cold, and I can't hear worth a damn. But I still remember the way that German boy's hand felt when I moved it off his chest to check for a pulse. Still remember Harlow chewing birch bark the night before, telling us about elk. Still remember the silence after the shooting stopped. Not peaceful silence, but the kind that presses on your ears because something loud and terrible just ended. People ask me sometimes what I learned in the war. They want me to say something wise, something about courage or brotherhood or sacrifice. And those things are true. We loved each other in that squad in a way I've never loved anyone since. We would have died for each other. Some of us did. But what I really learned is this. War doesn't care about cleverness. It doesn't care about mud tricks or hunting strategies or who deserves to live. It just eats people. And sometimes, if you're lucky or smart or both, you get to be the one walking away. That doesn't make you a hero. It just makes you alive. Harlow saved our lives that day, no question, and we killed 32 men because of it. Both things are true. I don't know how to reconcile them. Don't know that I'm supposed to. I think about those German boys a lot. Wonder who they were, if they had sisters, if they liked to fish, if they were scared the same way I was. I kept that letter I found, still can't read it, but I keep it in a box with my dog tags and a photograph of the squad. Sometimes I take it out and hold it and think about the mother who wrote it and the boy who never got to write back. This isn't a story about heroism. It's a story about mud and fear and 12 kids trying to survive a forest that wanted to eat them alive. We did. Harlow didn't. And I've spent 60 years trying to figure out if that was fair. I don't think it was, but fairness died in that forest long before we ever got there.